Hello and welcome to Politics and Societies of Southeast Europe. Our topic for this week, our general topic, is diasporas, conflict, and justice. What we're going to be concentrating on in this presentation is the violence that followed the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. We're going to start by looking at the structure of the violence and looking at some causes of violence. We're going to follow that with another section where we talk about some of the responses, particularly international responses to violence. And then finally, we're going to try to give an assessment of where people stand and what's happening in societies in relation to violence now. So let's begin by talking a little bit about what happened in the 1990s. As you know, there was a federal state called Yugoslavia, which broke into an increasing number of states, now 7 of them, several republics, and one entity which was an autonomous province, not a republic, Kosovo, declared independence. These declarations of independence were generally followed by a period of violence, a very short one with a small number of victims, just 9 victims in Slovenia in 1991, but this was followed with some larger conflicts. In Croatia, a conflict over control of territory that lasted from 1991 to 1995. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, a protracted conflict over control of territory involving forced changes in the structure of the population that lasted between 1992 and 1995. A briefer conflict involving eventually ending in independence in Kosovo in 1998 and 1999. A very brief conflict that ended with a power sharing agreement in Macedonia in 2001. Now, if you want to talk about the scale of these conflicts, I'm going to give you some numbers, but keep in mind, all of the numbers that I am giving you are estimates. In this conflict, as in every other conflict, we don't know the exact numbers of victims. Certainly the largest number of victims was in Bosnia and Herzegovina. How many? We're talking of somewhere in the range of 100,000 fatalities, possibly a little bit less than 100,000, 400,000 people displaced. In Croatia, the conflict lasted a longer time, but with a long frozen period and was smaller in scale. There were about 9,000 victims and 200,000 people displaced, most of these people from the ethnically Serb population of Croatia who were forced to migrate principally to Serbia in 1995. In Kosovo, a large quantity of displacement, some of it, most of it temporary, and about 2,000 victims. But I have to tell you, anytime anybody gives you victims of a large-scale incident of violence or an armed conflict, the numbers that you're going to get are going to be approximate. Generally, they're expressed in terms of a high estimate and a low estimate. We don't know exact numbers for any of these conflicts, and the reason for this is principally that that accurate records are not kept, and this is despite legends that you might hear about very accurate records being kept. Now, what were the causes of the violence that happened? I suppose in most cases you can say that the proximate cause was conflict over declarations of independence and whether these ought to be recognized. That is, there were wars of succession. But we still have to answer the question of why is it that violence took on the scale that it did with the level of participation that it had. And there are several hypotheses available for to account for the scale of violence in the former Yugoslavia. One of them is that there had been conflicts in the past that had not been resolved and around which grievances were still alive. Now, when we talk about conflicts from the past, I think we can probably dismiss rhetorical theories like that there are ancient and intractable ethnic hatreds. Most of the evidence suggests that there is not. There has been conflict over control of territory in the region. Most of this conflict dates from the period in the last part of the 19th century when the empires that controlled large territories in the region were declining. But the principal reference point is the Second World War, and the argument is that there were ongoing grievances and unaddressed conflicts dating from the Second World War that had not been resolved and that were brought back to life principally through the operation of propaganda in the 1990s. A second hypothesis is that there was always an inclination among the majorities of the populations in several of the republics toward a kind of national exclusivity. What kept it in containment was the authoritarian regime that was in power during the period of state socialism from 1995 to 1990. And the argument here runs that the price that people had to pay for social peace, for the absence of violence and conflict, was tolerating single-party rule in an authoritarian system. And that the communists, who often offered the argument, you could have a democratic state if you wanted to, but once you do, then it will break down into constituent parts and you'll have violence again, and it is exactly what we came to power in order to escape, that maybe they may have been right about this. A third possibility is that the conflict may have to do with the character of nationalism itself, which became ascendant as an ideology in the late 80s and the early 1990s. Now, there are a lot of definitions of nationalism out there. I've offered you a definition here on the slide that comes from Ernest Gellner, a political principle which holds that the political unit and the national unit should be congruent. Now, this is a nice, neat definition, and what makes it an interesting definition is that it describes a situation that is the case pretty much nowhere in the world. There are perhaps some monoethnic territories or almost monoethnic territories in some places in the world. Iceland might be one. But in most cases, the political and national units are not congruent. This is probably the case in most of the places where most of you live. And if they are not, and somebody wants to make it that way, there are really only two ways of accomplishing this. That is, change the territory or change the population. And I would argue that neither one of these goals is possible to achieve through peaceful means. The only way they can be achieved is through violence. There is also a whole set of theories that violence is the product of the effort of elites to maintain power, which was threatened by the demise of the state socialist system. And here in particular, we're talking about political elites wanting to maintain position and doing it by turning to maximalist national programs. And we're talking about institutions like the military, which in the state socialist system had its own parallel system of employment, of education, of real estate, of property, of benefits, of political power, and so on, that it was loath to let go of, and found that one of the ways in which it could maintain its power was by creating situations in which the military appeared to be necessary. There are several other hypotheses that are available to you. One of them has to do with the urban-rural divide, that this was a conflict between the urban population, which was cosmopolitan, relatively open, not strongly tied to ethnicity, and the rural population, which was strongly tied to ethnicity, which had been excluded largely and perceived as backward during the period of state socialism, and they took their revenge. One of the pieces of evidence that people like to point to support the revenge of the countryside, or the revenge of the excluded classes theory, is that the places that were targeted the most intensely during the period of violence were the places that were most cosmopolitan, most open to the world, that had the most mixed populations, and it was the symbols of mixed population that were the most prominent targets for many of the military and paramilitary forces. And finally, there's a theory that that this was a final victory, a result of years of engagement by what in the state socialist period was called the enemy emigration, that is, people from the groups who had left the country with the victory of the Communist Party in 1945, had been organizing their own little exclusive national groups in places like the United States, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and so on. That is, they were politically organized, took advantage of a period of instability, and managed to take over Now, these are political explanations for why violence could be mobilized. We have another question that we have to answer as well. And that is, why does mass violence happen in the first place? And here also you have several hypotheses that are available to you, several alternatives. The first of them is the most popular, and we're not going to spend a long time on it. It's something that you will find in most mainstream media coverage and also, unfortunately, in a lot of the mainstream political science, and that is that there was always the potential for mass violence. That is, that violence had been, they use the term brewing. And I suppose that when something brews, then at some point it's ready and you can pour it and it's available. So in this model, violence is like, what are some other things that brew? Tea or beer? I don't know. In any case, this is an ahistorical theory. It has a mythological character. What it does is it takes events and it projects them onto perceptions of the character of people. We already covered this, I think, in a good deal of detail in our second session when we talked about stereotypes about Southeast Europe. That's as much as there is to be said about this popular folk theory. A second model looks at the process that developed as an illustration of a model that's been developed by Gregory Stanton, the head of a group called Genocide Watch, which is a non-governmental organization trying to develop techniques of prevention of genocide that sees genocide developing in stages. We're going to return to this in a little bit, so I won't say a lot about it now. A third theory has to do with conditions in which large-scale violence occurs generally historically, and in the theory that is developed by Daniel Shiro and by Clark Macaulay, that is a political sociologist and a social psychologist. They have reviewed all of the instances that they're able to find of large-scale ethnically based violence in history, and they say one factor that is common to all of them is that they arise in a situation in which members of a majority group perceive members of a minority group as presenting some kind of basic existential threat to them, as being a threat to their existence. And the response to this then is a campaign to eliminate the group. Other theories have to do with elites and the role of elites and the willingness of political elites to resort to extreme measures, including violence, to maintain their position. This relies on making a distinction between elites who are willing to engage in violence to maintain their position and elites who are not. And then finally, it's worth mentioning the explanation that is offered by a political sociologist, Anthony Obershaw, who talks about the period where violence is becoming more possible as one in which people shift from the normal frame of understanding their position in the world and their life to a crisis frame. And in the crisis frame, people see themselves as being essentially threatened. And it's at that point that that extreme measures become possible, acceptable, become viewed as necessary, and that group loyalties and group affiliation becomes more important as a source of, or potential source of, protection. Now, let's return a little bit to Gregory Stanton and his model of how genocides happened through 10 stages. So these 10 stages, I'm just going to run through them, and this is how societies develop into periods of mass violence that can take the form of genocide, and then what happens after mass violence. So the first stage is what Stanton calls classification. And classification, differences between people are turned into essential differences of interest and identity, turn into principles of exclusion. So stereotypes are used to draw distinctions between an in-group and an out-group. Strategies of exclusion are developed for people who are labeled as being part of the out-group. In the next phase, these differences that are established through classification are symbolized. That is, there is a visual manifestation that is created of the difference between groups. People are probably familiar with the use of different kind of badges to be sewn on clothing that were mandated by the Nazis in the period of the genocide that was carried out by them. The yellow stars, the pink triangles, the red stars, and so forth. That is, ways in which difference takes on a visual form that is easily identifiable. Symbolization is followed by discrimination, that is, the systematic denial of rights, civil rights, citizenship rights, other types of rights to members of groups that are identified as the outgroup. The next stage we can call dehumanization, that is, people who are perceived as different are treated in ways that systematically deny them rights or personal dignity. It's in the dehumanization phase that you see propaganda used, so that, for example, in the genocide in Rwanda, Tutsis were referred to through popular media, through the popular radio station that organized the genocide, as cockroaches. Nazis referred to Jews as vermin, and so on. That is the association of people with animals to be looked down upon, the denial of human qualities to people. The next stage is organization, and this is the important thing about mass violence. It is never spontaneous. It is always planned. So in the organization period, you see the formation of groups, armed groups, the training of groups who will go on to carry out violence, the formation or toleration of paramilitaries, and so on. Then begins polarization, a period in which the goal of eliminating a group is made popular through propaganda, through the activity of hate groups. Then in preparation, concrete preparations are made for carrying out the violence. Part of it has to do with cultivating fear of the group that is meant to be a victim. Part of it is through arming and creating the means by which violence were carried out. There follows a period of persecution in which people are segregated, they are deported, they are starved, their property is appropriated, in which violence can begin. This is a period in which violence is made to appear normal and accessible. This is followed by the concrete stage of violence, where mass violence, where genocide is involved, extermination. That is, the people who are identified as victims are killed and otherwise abused in a deliberate and systematic campaign of violence. And then the final stage of genocide is denial. That is, that after the violence has occurred, after the victims have been created, the perpetrators or people who are following on the perpetrators try to justify the crime that was committed, try to deny that crimes happened, to minimize its proportions, and so on. So this is the basic cycle of violence that's described in the model proposed by Stanton. I think it's possible to see it in at least some of the instances in the conflict that we're looking at. I don't want to talk in detail about violence and the way it was conducted and so on. I think we want to concentrate on analyzing rather than describing violence. But in the next section, I want to talk about what happened after the violence occurred. So in the next segment of this presentation, we'll talk about responses to violence after the end of the conflict.